Thank you very much for inviting me. So it was a great pleasure to take part in this report and to talk at this event.
Thomas, thank you very much once again. I just wanted to say it's a huge pleasure to have you participating in this meeting, which has been very insightful after the study by the Fundação Francisco Manuel dos Santos. So now, over to you. Good luck. Enjoy.
Thank you. Okay. So I hope you can see the slides. Perfect. So thank you very much, everyone, for coming. And, I will talk about creating value in the global economy, which is a bit of an ambitious title, but I'll try to give you some ideas about what I think is going to happen over the next 20, 30 years. So I think the first point to keep in mind is where we are today. And that's important because it's not as if it's not as if the economy is in some kind of steady state. I think that in Europe, we are still, of course, in the post-global financial crisis, the post-Eurozone debt crisis period, and that still manifests in many financial markets and interest rates. At the same time, we are emerging from the COVID crisis somewhat faster than people expected 2 years ago. So I think that's what dominates the economic landscape. In terms of geopolitics, I think we are really just entering the age of rivalry between the US and China, and I don't think we've seen the extent to which that can dominate the political landscape in the future. And finally, I think by all measures, we are behind where we should be in terms of dealing with climate change. So I think this sets the stage for where we are today, and that's going to shape policy over the next decade at least. So let me talk briefly perhaps about the first point, to say that I am not worried at all about financial stability in Europe. I think that one of the more striking results of the COVID crisis is that we did not have a banking crisis anywhere, and we had a limited impact on funding for governments. So to me, it means that the many reforms that Europe has put together after 2010 to deal with both banking and sovereign risk, I think these reforms have been successful, and therefore I don't think that's going to be a big issue for the future, despite the obvious thing that it's going to put some constraint on what governments can finance. But I don't think that's a major risk there. I don't see a financial risk there. So really what I want to do is talk a little bit about policy making, and starting from something that's a bit old, what we call the Washington Consensus in the 1990s. And I think it's important to go back there because I think there is still some misconception about what happened. And I think that it would be a bad idea to actually reject the Washington Consensus entirely. So I will highlight a few things that consensus got right. Then I will talk about some work I have done for the G7 for the Cornwall meeting last summer, thinking about what could be the important features of a new consensus. And then I'll give you some what I think will be the nature of competition among countries or nations in the future. So if you look at the Washington Consensus, it was really based on, well, it was 10 points, but actually the points were repetitive, so I think you can actually summarize it in 7. On the fiscal side, it was avoid large deficits, broaden the tax base, and have low marginal tax rates. There was actually a strong emphasis on the need to invest in health and education, and that was actually a big part of the Washington Consensus, actually. Finance was very much like laissez-faire, which was let the market set interest and exchange rates. Trade was all about liberalization in FDI. Product market was privatization and deregulation. And in terms of law and economics, the focus was on property rights. So of course, what's striking is that these priorities reflect the issues that people were dealing with at the end of the 80s and the early 90s, especially developing countries. So not surprisingly, this recommendation make more sense if you think about Latin America or like less developed countries at the time. But what I think is important to understand is after the Washington Consensus was somewhat agreed on, in the early 2000s, there was a huge pushback where the leitmotif, if you wish, was the Washington Consensus is dead and probably useless. And what's interesting is that recent research shows that this is a premature autopsy. That is, in fact, the Washington Consensus might have been wrong in some dimension, but it actually is not dead. And the funny thing is people declare the consensus dead almost exactly at the time where the consensus started to pay off, which is not something that is so uncommon in economic policy. So what you see on this graph is what we call convergence. So convergence is the idea that in an ideal world, the law of economics should be such that poor countries catch up with rich countries. So you should see that the richer you are, the more slowly you grow, or vice versa. The poorer you are, the faster you grow. And what you see in data from the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, even from the 1990s, actually, this plots the growth rate of GDP, so the growth on the y-axis, and then the GDP per capita on the x-axis. So convergence is the idea that this curve should be downward sloping. That is, rich countries should grow slowly, and poor countries should grow relatively quickly. And of course, that's not what you see. And in fact, people were puzzled by that, and it was called the issue of divergence. And part of the divergence was blamed on the Washington Consensus, because after all, the idea was, well, if you follow these simple rules from the Washington Consensus, then the law of economics should apply, and therefore, if you are a relatively poor country, you should catch up. The problem is there was no catch up, and so people declared the consensus was dead. And what's almost ironic is that they declared the consensus dead in the 2000 precisely at the time where it started to work. So exactly in the 2000 and 2010s, what you see is convergence. So now the slope is clearly down, which means that poor countries grow faster than rich countries in today's world. On the right, you see the same thing expressed in quartiles. So these are the growth rates and sorted by quartile of income. So the orange, the bright orange is these are the poor countries of first quartile, and then the rich countries top quartile blue. So you see that until somewhere around here, which I don't know, maybe it's like the late 90s or mid 90s, there was definitely no convergence in the sense that rich countries kept growing faster than poor countries. And that's actually changed. And in the past 20 years, it's almost a perfect convergence. So in fact, here the last estimate you see is that it's exactly the opposite of the quartiles. So systematically, countries that are poor grow faster than countries that are rich. So the first point is that it was definitely premature to declare the Washington Consensus dead. And the thing that's interesting is that if you look at the main reason for the fact that convergence is finally happening, it's because the institutions have converged among many countries. So countries have actually tried to some extent to implement the Washington Consensus, and that has led to convergence. But what's even more interesting is if you look deeper and look at quantitatively what actually matters, you come down with only two things, which is education and investment. And even if you compare education and investment, you find that by far the best predictor of growth over long periods of time is education. So in that framework, I think that this is where I think the emphasis and the optimism about Portugal is really coming from, which is that all the data we have, and the more data we gather, the more it becomes clear is that the best thing a country can do to help its economy grow is to invest in education. And so, of course, since this is the well-known success story of Portugal over the past 20 years, I think that's the main reason to be optimistic. Just like that. Okay, now there's another point in the Washington Consensus that I also want to defend, which is the idea that competition is good. So this is a focus on the EU, and what you see here on the left is the OECD measure of product market regulation. So it's actually an index of regulation, so that means the higher it is, the harder it is to compete. Okay, so if you want free market, correspond to a low value of the index. And the red line is the US. So what you can see over the past 4 decades is that there is a systematic convergence towards low regulation and towards free market. And that most of the countries in Europe have achieved a level of open market which is very similar to that of the US. The right shows you how it was achieved. So this is data from the IMF where we encode essentially the number of reforms. So on average, during the period from the mid-90s to the late, say 2010, we had one major product market reform per country per year in Europe. Okay. And that's essentially the reason we managed to converge with the US on that. Now, that's important because another place where I think the more data we have, the more it confirms the key insight and the key conventional wisdom is that competition is good. There's just no way around the fact that it's good. So here you see these indicators on the left. It shows you the change in the indicator as a function of the initial indicator. So that's a bit like the convergence story, except that it's not for growth. Here it's for the institutions that promote competition. And so what you see is countries that had, like say, Great Britain at the top left. Well, Great Britain already had very much pro-market policies. So there was not much they could do to improve that. While countries that started much further, say Poland, for instance, these are the countries that had the biggest improvement in their index, that is the biggest decrease in their barriers to entry. And now this, you could say, well, that phenomenon is worldwide. And that's true to some extent, because the OECD, the IMF, and the US administration propose these policies to all countries around the world. But what is striking in the data is the convergence is much faster within Europe than in the rest of the world. And that, I think, is the distinct impact of EU competition policy, both formally through its authority, but also informally via peer pressure and the review of countries. So we've achieved improvement in terms of free market and competition in Europe much more quickly than in the rest of the world and more quickly than one would have expected. And you can see the impact of that everywhere. My favorite example is still coming from my own France, which is the price of telecommunication. So this is the comparison of the price of telecom services in France compared to the US. And we used to be 10 to 15% more expensive than the US, broadly speaking. And then we had a very important deregulation in 2011, which was the entry of Free as a fourth wireless operator. And then 2 years later, prices went down 30%, and today they are 50% below the US. So it's literally, it costs you half in France to have a smartphone than it costs you in the US. And you've seen that in France, but of course you've seen that in many other countries, in part sometimes because Free also entered in some other countries. So that's very strong in Italy as well. But Portugal has also benefited from this free market. And that's why you have, compared to 20 or 30 years ago, you have much better and cheaper telecommunication services. So the more we look at that, the more we see it's good. It's good for growth. It's good for consumers. It's even good for inequality, actually, because many of these deregulated industries tend to have fixed price per household. So if you lower the price, you actually reduce inequality. So I think that's actually a major improvement in Europe. and a part of the consensus that we definitely want to keep. Now, of course, it doesn't mean that the old Washington consensus got it right. That would be amazing because they were really focused on dealing with emerging market issues. And now most of the world has graduated from that. So we have other issues to deal with. And this is the task that the G7 gave us. So it was a group of 7 people, 1 from each country. So I was nominated by France. And we were tasked to think about, broadly speaking, building economic resilience. But we thought that a useful way to do it would be to revisit some of the ideas from the Washington consensus and see which ones survive and which one need to be changed. I think I've emphasized already 2 that I think were absolutely in the Washington consensus and were completely right, which is the emphasis on education and healthcare investment and on free market. I think these are cornerstones of economics and they should remain so. But of course, the Washington consensus had very little to say about some of the other issues that I think are much more important for us today. So when we worked on the Cornwall consensus, we were, first of all, it was the midst of COVID, so obviously global health was a major issue, and then it becomes very clear that there is a need for better coordination and investment at the global level. Climate change and environment is a topic that is probably the most important going forward over the next 2 or 3 decades. And I think we are behind the curve. We need to do a lot more. So we had some proposal about that involve pooling research resources across countries. And the third thing that's obviously very different is the digital economy. So digital governance has become a very tricky issue. And I think that if we want to be able to use to their full extent the advantages of the digital economy, we're going to need a better digital governance system. Finally, we had some, of course, reports on the WTO, the reform of the WTO, how to improve labor standard and inclusion, and specifically some proposal about supply chain resilience. So, of course, I don't want to go through each of them, but I just want to highlight the fact that these are complementary to some of the old ideas from the Washington consensus. Not so much to replace them, but to bring a complement. So I think this is going to be the world in which we're going to live over the next 20 years. This consensus, I'm not claiming that the Cornwall consensus got all the details right, or that we have exactly the right weight on different priorities, but I'm pretty convinced that these are the topics and ideas that are going to set policy over the next 20 or 30 years. And so then the question is, in that new world, what does it look like to create value for a country? What does it look like for a country to find its place? And what can policy makers do to improve the rank of their country? So the first point is, there's a question mark because I don't know for sure, but my sense is that tax competition, which was clearly a big part of competition across countries over the past 20 years, let's not be naive here. I think that's going to decrease. I think it's not going to zero, and it's nowhere near going to zero, but I think it's going to be less prevalent. So the idea of simply lowering marginal tax rates on capital to attract FDI, although it remains important to have broad-based taxes and low marginal rates to the extent you can, I just don't think it's going to be the first order thing that's going to drive attractiveness at the country level. I put a question mark because I don't know for sure. This is based on recent trends and the discussions at the OECD that I followed closely, but this could be reversed by a change in administration in Washington or by disagreements in Europe. So it's not guaranteed, but I think it's quite likely. So then the question becomes, if you don't compete on marginal tax rates, what do you compete on? And I think that the first thing that's going to be important is the regulatory framework and infrastructure. And the infrastructure are still physical. So as we see today with the disruption in global chain, it's not as if physical infrastructure are not important. They remain extremely important. But obviously, once you've achieved some level of efficiency in your physical infrastructure, I think that it's the regulatory system, the contract laws, and digitalization of contract, speed at which you can transfer information across border. I think these are going to be and in a secured fashion as well. I think dealing with cyber risk. I think probably these are the infrastructure that are likely to be relatively more important over the next 10 or 20 years. And my sense there is because talking to firms or CFOs or risk manager, they are all arguing that physical infrastructure are very important and they want to be on top of managing the risk of disruption. But to some extent, COVID is as big a shock as we can see, and we know we're going to be able to deal with it. And I think that the solution might be a bit costly, but we know what they are. So I think that in that sense, physical infrastructure is a relatively more straightforward answer. Now, the other part, dealing with cyber risk and dealing with the infrastructure that allow you to leverage digital economy, I think that the questions are much less clear, and therefore, the answers are much less clear, and therefore I think there's more scope there for countries to improve. The last thing, though, is, and I'm going back to my first theme, not because I wanted to, but because if you look at the data, this is what strikes you, is going back to education. Which is, again, if you look broadly at all the research that people have produced over the past 5 or 10 years, trying to understand what is it exactly that motivates firm to choose a particular location, what is it exactly that predicts whether a particular industry can develop and be successful in a particular location, particular country or region or city. Overwhelmingly, what comes out is education. That is at the end of the day, the rare resource that is gonna be the true binding constraint is the supply of educated people. And I think that this is quite likely to be the most important decision that policymakers can focus on. And I just want to illustrate, to be a bit concrete, with one recent paper, very recent. It's like the paper is 3 months old. It was just presented at a conference where I was. And it's about innovation clusters in the US. So what the authors do is using machine learning algorithms, they can track the diffusion and creation and diffusion of all disruptive technologies in the US over the past 20 or 30 years. And then, so they focus on the disruptive innovations in the sense that these are innovations that are new. They did not exist for a while, and then when they appear big time, and you can see them everywhere. Okay. So I think that narrows down the choice to 40 or 80 different types of innovations. So what do they find? The first thing they find, of course, is that something we kind of knew already, but confirming it on a very large scale, the production of innovation is very concentrated. So the panel A shows you the tech hubs. And as you can see, the tech hubs are very few and in very specific locations. And not surprisingly, you can see Boston, New York, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. So that concentration is very high. If anything, it tends to become higher over time. Then the second panel, E, shows you the employment linked to this technology 5 to 6 years after their discovery. Okay, so one of these technologies is going to be always discovered in one of the hubs, in one of the big circles. But then, of course, it's going to diffuse in the US. And then you can see on the panel E where employment using this technology is located 5 to 6 years down the road. And what you see here, again, is quite striking. So obviously, the initial hub, the initial cluster retains a large advantage. That's not surprising. But the diffusion is relatively broad, but still very concentrated. So it's going to diffuse over the US, but it's not going to go anywhere randomly. It's going to go to places where people can use the technology. And if you try then to predict which places these are, you will find that these are places where firms can find educated workers. Some other stuff can matter, like cities can give a tax break for a company to come and locate itself. Some lightening of some regulatory burden. These are not zero. Okay? They might be somewhat important, but compared to finding educated workers, they are second order. the thing that really matters the most for the firms is, are they going to find the right people? And the last thing I want to point out is, so the graph on the left shows you the share of college educated among the technologies. And on the x-axis, you have years since the invention or the emergence of the technology. So not surprising, you start very high. In the place where the technology is invented, most people are highly educated. And then as the years passes and then the technology diffuses in the country, then the requirement becomes less binding. So you can have some democratization in the sense that people with a bit less education can still use the technology. But the thing that's striking to see is that it doesn't go much below 50%. That is, even 5 or 10 years after the technology is invented, it still requires a lot of educated people just to be able to use it. So my conclusion, which is not very original, because it goes back to some idea that were actually there already in the 80s, is that at the end of the day, in today's world with global value chains, if you ask and try to forecast what is going to be the most important thing that's going to drive firm to decide to locate their activities in Portugal, is going to be, can they find people with the right education? So I think that should be the priority for going forward. Thank you.